So what about North America? I talked about the US a lot. Canada, as I mentioned, is disappointed over the last 12 to 18 months because of the fall of oil prices. A lot of the growth in Canada in recent years had been driven by the development of the oil sands industry, the tar sands up there in Alberta. But the Canadian dollar is weakened, so this is giving a new lease on life for Canadian manufacturing. Canadian manufacturing had been battered over the last decade. It really struggled to compete with all of its major competitors for the US market. This is a new opportunity. Perhaps now Canada can start to attract some more manufacturing investment. And then Mexico, you've heard me describe Mexico as the world's most disappointing economy. It should be growing a lot faster than it is. I mean, you look at the last 5 years, it's grown at an average of less than 3% per year. There's no excuse for a country at this level of development, with this level of access to the North American market, to be growing that slow. They liberalized their oil and gas industry last year. We talked about that last year, that they were going to probably do that in the near future. They did it, but they received very little investment so far. They, of course, liberalized it at the time when oil prices were falling, and there's still a lot of, let's say, distrust with the Mexican government there. So they haven't achieved the levels of investment they wanted. They haven't reached the growth rates that they had hoped for. We do expect growth to accelerate some, but nevertheless, the Mexican economy should be doing a lot better. And then as far, I'll just touch upon Central America and the Caribbean. Central America is continuing the struggle from huge levels of crime and corruption. Crime rates have soared. You've seen probably some specials on the situation in El Salvador. The threat is also in place in Guatemala and Honduras that we get back to these type of levels of crime. And it's really unfortunate, because these are countries that have access through the free trade deals with North America to have access to these markets. They have good sources of labor. They have good access to the markets. They just do not attract any of the investment that they need to really build up their economies. And Costa Rica is a nice thing. Costa Rica had been for a long time the most successful economy in the world. Intel is a major investor there. They pulled a lot of their investment, a lot of their operations out of Costa Rica last year due to fears that the government there was going to put some new restrictions on them and some new taxes on them. So they just pulled out. And then Panama continues to lead the way. Panama is benefiting, one, from a fast-growing financial sector, and two, the expansion of the Panama Canal, which is scheduled to be completed this year. Now, Nicaragua, they were supposed to start building a canal, this very mysterious canal in Nicaragua. They were supposed to start building it. It's been delayed. When they had a groundbreaking ceremony for it, and I think the only thing there is one of those workers' huts where the canal is supposed to start. They haven't done anything yet, but they're still there's a Hong Kong company behind it talking about building a canal across Nicaragua. We talked at length about the US election, which is absolutely fascinating. We have a new government, of course, in Canada. The Liberals took power there late last year. Most of what got the attention here was the fact that they agreed to accept, I think it's 50,000 Syrian refugees over the next 12 months. They are only accepting families. That's been a big issue in Europe, where some countries have said, we'll accept families if they come in, but we don't want to accept unemployed young males, because there's nothing more dangerous in the world than a bored, unemployed young male. And that's what's happened in a lot of countries. But Canada has said we will only allow families to come here. South America, I mentioned South America this past year actually shrank. Its economic output was down by about 1%. Brazil is the main culprit for that. We talked about Brazil, but all across the board, Venezuela is in a collapse. Argentina has a new government. They've had left-wing governments there for 15 years. They got a new center-right president, Mauricio Macri, who is saying all the right things about economic reform and dealing with the debt issue, but it's going to be a painful road for Argentina over the next few years. And for many of the countries in the region, they had been growing on the back of high commodity prices. Countries like Peru, Chile, Colombia benefited tremendously from the high price of copper and tin and other natural resources. Those prices have come down just like we've seen the oil price come down, and that's hurt these economies significantly. We expect some of those to start rising towards the end of the forecast period, hence the rather, let's say, little more optimistic than others forecast for those countries. But nevertheless, this will be a region that continues to disappoint over the next few years. Pretty quiet on the election front. The key issue is going to be to watch in Venezuela. They had their election in December, where the parliament there is now dominated by the right-wing opposition. They won a 2/3 majority, which means they could basically enact any legislation they want, overturning the left-wing President Nicolas Maduro there. But the Supreme Court in that country, which is dominated by supporters of the president, barred 3 members of the parliament from taking their seats on electoral irregularities, even though the government has done enough of that. So they don't have their 2/3 majority. They do have a large majority, but not 2/3. So how this plays out in the next few months is going to be very interesting. This is a country in total economic collapse. The two sides are very much at loggerheads right now, and there could be some significant unrest in Venezuela and among its neighboring countries in the coming months. And one other interesting thing I'll talk about is in Colombia. We are very close to a peace deal between the government and the FARC rebels. The FARC are the far-left rebel group, which has had an insurgency there since the 1960s. They had set a deadline for March 2016 to reach a comprehensive peace deal. They've been negotiating in Cuba for a couple of years now. They asked recently for the United Nations to prepare a monitoring force to come to Colombia, which seems to suggest that this peace deal is imminent. Both sides asked for it. That could be a huge development. This is a country with huge potential, untapped potential, both in terms of natural resources, in terms of consumers, in terms of tourism. So Colombia could be a high-growth market in the coming years, particularly if this peace deal can be reached and then subsequent peace deals with smaller groups in that country be reached. So Colombia is one country in Latin America where the outlook is definitely trending upwards. I mentioned Brazil. I'm not going to talk much more about that, but it's been a huge disappointment. They have the Summer Olympics this year. It's going to be a very interesting Olympics to see how that goes. I don't think there'll be too many problems, but if you remember the FIFA World Cup a couple years ago, there were huge protests just before the World Cup started. And the situation is a lot worse today than it was then. So will there be unrest? Will there be major protests going on before or during the Olympics?